Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to CSIS. I'm Jeff Mankoff, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program here, and I will be chairing our panel this afternoon on Central Asia's economic picture. If you follow Central Asia in the press, you've probably seen stories about significant problems in Turkmenistan and problems that maybe don't quite rise to that level in some of the other countries. But there's not a general story, I guess. We don't tend to follow economic developments in Central Asia very closely here in Washington. I was just talking with Ambassador Courtney, and he was congratulating this group of very devoted followers of all things Central Asia. But unfortunately, Central Asia has a way of falling off the map. And I think when we do talk about the region here, it's often in the context of security, terrorism, Afghanistan, and that sort of thing. But with the challenges in Turkmenistan right now and the economic difficulties that some of the other countries in the region are going through, we thought it would be a really good time to do a panel on the economic environment in Central Asia, which of course has implications for security, but also for the way that people's lives in those countries go. So I'm very happy to welcome Ambassador William Courtney, who is now an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and executive director of the RAND Business Leaders Forum. Among the many posts that he held during a long and distinguished career at the State Department was ambassador to Kazakhstan. And he's going to talk to us about the macro perspective in the region and a little bit about Kazakhstan. And then to my right is Bruce Pannier, who is a senior correspondent for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who covers Central Asia from Prague. He's the author of the Kishilok Ovazi blog on Central Asia and probably the best informed foreign correspondent on Central Asia, at least that I've had the privilege of speaking to. So he's going to talk about Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and then we will open it up for discussion. We are recording. The recording of this event will be posted on the website, so we're on the record. And I hope you find this useful and interesting, and look forward to your comments. So without further ado, Bill?
Jeff, thanks very much. I congratulate CSIS for hosting this session on an important region that is sometimes underrated in the West. It's a pleasure to join Bruce Pannier, a most insightful observer of Central Asia, and Jeff Mankoff, a superb scholar of the former Soviet space. By coincidence, this discussion takes place hours after the opening in Beijing of the Central Asia Investment Forum, sponsored by the EBRD and the People's Bank of China. There, EBRD President Suma Chakrabarti said earlier today, with a growth rate of 4.6% forecast for this year, Central Asia is growing faster than any other region in which EBRD operates. He highlighted the value of diversification of the economies of Central Asia and noted that EBRD has invested $14 billion in Central Asia. The GDP of Central Asia last year was $265 billion, of which Kazakhstan accounts for 3/5. By way of comparison, Central Asia's GDP last year exceeded that of the 6 European Union partnership states. In constant dollars, the economy of Central Asia grew by 26% from 2012 through 2017. Kazakhstan's growth was only 17.5%, but the average growth of the other 4 economies was much higher, 43% over that 5-year period. Lower oil prices were one reason for Kazakhstan's slower growth. Going forward, the IMF predicts subdued growth for Central Asia. To offset this, the IMF calls for a, quote, more deliberate push toward private sector-led growth. Per capita GDP in Central Asia varies widely. Based on purchasing power parity, Kazakhstan's GDP per capita in 2017 was $8,840. Turkmenistan's was a bit lower, but per capita incomes in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan were far lower. The World Bank classifies Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan as upper-middle income countries. In attracting foreign direct investment, there are wide gaps among Central Asian countries. According to UNCTAD's World Investment Report, Central Asia last year attracted $7.28 billion in inflows of foreign direct investment, of which 95% flowed to Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. 3 energy projects in Kazakhstan are attracting substantial foreign direct investment. Tengiz, the world's deepest producing supergiant oil field; Kashagan, an offshore supergiant oil field; and Karachaganak, one of the world's largest gas condensate fields. Tengiz is undergoing a $37 billion expansion, the largest single oil expansion project in the world. Kazakhstan is also the world's largest uranium producer, 2nd largest of chromium, and 7th largest of bauxite. Other Central Asian states have strengths. Turkmenistan is the world's 10th largest producer of natural gas and has the world's 4th largest proven gas reserves. Uzbekistan is the world's 6th largest producer of cotton and 9th largest producer of gold. Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan have substantial hydroelectric potential. Tajikistan is building the Rogun Dam, the tallest dam in the world. Narcotics smuggling from Afghanistan and production in parts of Central Asia also have an economic impact. Global indices help put in context Central Asia's performance. In the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan are ranked. On average, they score at the 61st percentile. In other words, about 3/5 of the world's countries do better and 2/5 do worse. In the Rule of Law Index of the World Justice Project, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan are ranked. On average, their performance is at the 70th percentile. In the Corruption Perceptions Index of Transparency International, Central Asia does least well. Average performance is in the 82nd percentile. In all 3 indices, Kazakhstan is the best performer. Economics and governance reforms help explain why. Several World Bank and IMF comments are of special interest. Since 2002, GDP per capita in Kazakhstan has risen 6-fold, and poverty incidence has fallen sharply. Priorities ought to include privatizing state-owned enterprises, cutting subsidies, and strengthening public finances and banking. Kyrgyzstan's growth last year exceeded expectations, it was 4.5%, with remittances surging by 25% in dollar terms. There is much room in Kyrgyzstan for expansion of agriculture, hydroelectricity, and tourism. Tajikistan has rapidly reduced poverty, but done less well in improving public goods and services. Further steps are needed to restore the confidence of bank depositors. Liabilities for large state-owned enterprises in Tajikistan are a risk. Turkmenistan faces challenges in reducing its external deficit. Priorities should include simplifying procedures and regulations, accelerating privatization of state-owned enterprises, and attracting foreign direct investment. Finally, according to the World Bank and IMF, Uzbekistan's economy grew rapidly over the past decade and lifted parts of the population out of poverty. Last year, Tashkent launched ambitious market-oriented reforms. Challenges include creating jobs for the rapidly growing labor force and diversifying agriculture to crops that are higher value and less water intensive. Let me close with a few broader observations. First, the Soviet legacy of state ownership of economic assets and top-down decision-making remains a heavy burden. In every country of Central Asia, economic performance can be boosted by allowing a wider scope for the private sector and by decentralizing governance and making it more responsive. Second, although most Central Asian leaders say they want to diversify their economies, they are reluctant to facilitate this by privatizing state-owned enterprises and reducing excessive regulation. Third, as Sursuma Chakrabarti said today in Beijing, policy reform can help in such areas as improving the business climate, protecting property rights, and complying with international anti-corruption standards. Fourth, Caspian energy is of global importance, but it competes in a world market that is being transformed by the shale revolution and new sources of supply. Fifth, Central Asians benefit from Belt and Road investments, but should be careful not to take on too much debt. Improved transport infrastructure across Central Asia will yield greater gains if the region's economies become part of global and regional supply chains. Too little of this is happening. Sixth, slower growth in Russia lessens demand for migrant workers, and trade distortions from the Eurasian Economic Union can be harmful. Central Asians can mitigate these risks by deepening reforms to increase competitiveness and create more and better job opportunities. Seventh, Western sanctions on Russia cause collateral damage to Central Asian economies, even though the West seeks to minimize this. Finally, spillover effects from the war in Afghanistan may remain a long-term burden on Central Asian economic development, especially for the frontline states. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for a presentation that had a lot of data and a very broad scope, and that also had a fair bit of good news. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, who I think is going to give us more bad news.
First, I want to thank CSIS for inviting me here. Obviously, this is a pleasure to be here and address you all. It's an honor to be sitting next to these two distinguished gentlemen, certainly, and I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming out. I'm going to start with some basic facts because I'm going to do Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. In some ways, the problems they got are comparable. Certainly, they all suffer from corruption and mismanagement, but I would also point out in the case of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, and I'll tighten this up a little bit in a minute, that their geographic location works against them in many ways and has been hurting their economy for quite some time. Since both of them are in the eastern part of Central Asia and they're backed up against the mountains with China, this is particularly acute in Tajikistan, which of course is in the corner in the high Pamir Mountains on the one side with China, and then Afghanistan, so it's kind of boxed in there. It's not the case for Turkmenistan, certainly, but unfortunately the politics that the government has pursued of what I would call isolationism, but the Turkmen government prefers the term positive neutrality, have hurt the country's ties with neighboring states and prevented it from becoming really a regional transit hub that it should become. The three compare in terms of percentage of arable land, although for different reasons there's a different landscape, but for instance, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan all have less than 20% arable land. In fact, it's a lot closer to 10% now. In Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan's case, that's because they're mountainous. In Turkmenistan's case, that's because it's mostly desert. The populations of all three of these countries, as is true across Central Asia, are increasing, but certainly there's some variation here. At the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, Kyrgyzstan had about 5.2 million people. It now has 6.25 million, 6.3 maybe. So that's a 20% increase in one generation since the fall of the Soviet Union. Tajikistan had 6 million people, roughly at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, now has more than 9. So that's a 50% increase in one generation. Turkmenistan is kind of difficult to say. They did a census not quite 10 years ago and never released the results, so we don't know. But they did have about 4.2 million at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. Best estimates say it's 5 million, maybe a little bit more. So again, we see a 20% roughly increase in population in the span of one generation. All three of them, of course, are down by that, not Kyrgyzstan a little bit separated, but they're down in the southern part. So the southern trade route is practically inaccessible to them. Tajikistan and Turkmenistan have borders with Afghanistan. It's true that Turkmenistan has a border with Iran, but Turkmen-Iranian relations at the moment are not so good. So in terms of trade, there's only one way to go, and that's north. Eventually, to get either west or east, you're going to have to go north sooner or later mostly through Kazakhstan, but also in some cases it's possible through Uzbekistan. So they're dependent on their neighbors to reach the outside world. Now, Kyrgyzstan, Ambassador Courtney already mentioned some of the GDP figures for this, but Kyrgyzstan, according to the World Bank, Kyrgyzstan's GDP per capita in 2017 was $1,220. Kyrgyzstan is right now suffering in terms of foreign trade from huge Chinese loans, or at least balancing their budget from huge Chinese loans and Russian loans, although they go toward different projects, and I'll get into that in a little bit later. And hopefully we'll have some questions about OBOR or Belt and Road Initiative, whichever you prefer to call it. Kyrgyzstan's economy, or at least their biggest export, is gold. But unfortunately for Kyrgyzstan, the contracts that they signed, at least the contract they signed for the big gold mine, Kumtor, in the early 1990s, is disadvantageous to the Kyrgyz state, the Kyrgyz people, and I'll explain that a little bit more by saying that according to the contract, not only are they a minority shareholder in the gold mine, but the terms are that the gold mine is taxed and they take their profits off gold ore, not processed. So it is taken outside the country and processed, meaning it is sold off at a lower price and taxed at a lower price than it needs to be, or than it could be, certainly. After gold, there are no substantial industries in Kyrgyzstan. It is still an agriculturally dependent state. There is, however, and Ambassador Courtney mentioned, dependence on remittances. Now, Kyrgyzstan is the most dependent country on remittances in the world. Some 35% of the GDP comes from remittances from migrant laborers. Most of them work in Russia, which means Kyrgyzstan depends on the Russian economy. Kyrgyzstan's external debt to China is 41% of its total external debt at the moment. Corruption siphons off a lot of the money that comes into this too. We just saw an example of that at the start of this year. The thermal power plant in Bishkek failed in January, broke down after the Chinese had given $386 million to redo the plant. Of course, in the coldest part of winter too, so large parts of Bishkek, the capital, were without heat. And it turned out the subsequent investigation found that as much as $100 million of that $368 million went missing. Kyrgyzstan's economy as it stands now, besides agriculture, besides the sale of gold, is basically founded on re-export. And what I mean by that is they buy goods from China, which are brought in at a fairly low price, and they have sold them off to neighbors. Now, I'll get to both the neighbors in a minute. Mostly this went through Kazakhstan for years and years, and Kazakhstan was part of the EU, the EEU, Eurasian Economic Union. They weren't supposed to be accepting any goods that came from China out of Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan joined the Eurasian Economic Union too. Last year, the two countries had a fallout. It was very unfortunate, but it was on the level of personal insults from the Kyrgyz president against the Kazakh president. And all of a sudden, the Kazakh customs agents said, "Oh my gosh, look at all this stuff at the border that's coming from China and was never supposed to be coming into or crossing the Kazakh border at all." Clearly, this has been going on for years and years, but with the collapse of relations, all of a sudden the Kazakh government decided they would pull this out and say, you can't do this anymore. This is ridiculous. Now, relations have improved since Kyrgyzstan got a new president, and the issue has faded away, which leads me to believe that, in fact, Kyrgyzstan is engaged in re-exports again. It's a big source of income for the common average person, too. I mean, this is something that it's not done by government officials, so much and making extra money and stuff. The average person in Kyrgyzstan finds ways to get their own income by using this re-export scheme. The fact that Kyrgyzstan has better relations with Uzbekistan now plays a big role too, because the border with Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan was pretty much closed off for a long time, so hardly anything came across that border at all. I have already seen reports that said that this re-export of Chinese goods through Kyrgyzstan has resumed in Uzbekistan after about a 10-year gap. And so it appears that that's another way they can make money by reselling this stuff into Uzbekistan. Ambassador Courtney also mentioned a big boost for Kyrgyzstan. This is the good news. A big boost for Kyrgyzstan, it could come through hydropower projects. They have hydropower plants already, the Taktagul Reservoir. They are figured into part of the CASA 1000 program, Central Asia, South Asia, meaning that Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan will sell electricity from hydropower plants to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, this would help them a lot. They could make a lot of money off of this. Kyrgyzstan still needs to build the Kambar Ata hydropower plant. It's going to cost minimum $3 billion. They're going to need to take loans from that. It will have a capacity of nearly 2,000 megawatts when it's done. And they could become not only energy self-sufficient at that point, but an electricity exporter, which would also help their economy. Kyrgyzstan, as I mentioned, has joined the Eurasian Economic Union. It's really mixed results. Even at the time when they joined it, the Prime Minister then, Joomart Otarbayev, said that they really had no choice. He wouldn't comment too much on the economic benefits, but he said we simply have no choice but to do this. Now, when Vladimir Putin was in Uzbekistan last month, he signed a bunch of deals with Uzbekistan that the Kyrgyz, I think, rightly pointed out were far more advantageous for Uzbekistan, who is not a member of the EU, than the deal that Kyrgyzstan has through the EU with Russia as trade. So it hasn't made a huge difference. Kyrgyz officials stress the fact these are its early years, and it still could be fruitful for Kyrgyzstan in the future. So they haven't given up on the deal, but the results to date are not really so optimistic at the moment. Move on to Tajikistan. Now, the World Bank says the GDP per capita in Tajikistan in 2017 was $800. They have an aluminum plant in Tursunzade in the western part of the country. That's probably the biggest moneymaker that they have in the country. Otherwise, there are no substantial industries. They do have gold industry, but it's not, it still needs to have a lot of development before it's going to pay off any big dividends. Tajikistan is the third most dependent country on remittances in the world. About 31% of the GDP comes from remittances. Again, like Kyrgyzstan, these are mostly from migrant laborers who work in Russia, which also makes Tajikistan dependent on the Russian economy. As far as foreign debt to China, more than half of Tajikistan's foreign debt is to China at the moment. Corruption is also a big problem, but it's different than the one in Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan's government is much more diffuse, and it has changed several times over the years through revolutions, and fortunately this last time through a legitimate presidential election. Tajikistan, the power is consolidated in the hands of the family of President Rahman, and his relatives are the ones who own almost every major industry you could possibly name. And again, they don't have very many major industries, but such wealth as is available out there, as is present, pretty much belongs to someone in the presidential family at some point. Like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan could profit a lot from CASA 1000 if they get in. Ambassador Courtney again mentioned Ragun, which is being built. And in fact, if they hold the schedule, the first unit of the Ragun hydropower plant should be launched Friday. So they are also looking at the possibility of increasing state revenues through the export of hydropower electricity. Like Kyrgyzstan, also the better ties with Uzbekistan open up a new trade route. Now, as bad as Uzbek ties were for years and years and the border being shut, the fact is that the Tajik-Uzbek border has been shut almost from the very beginning of independence because of Tajikistan's civil war. First president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, saw Tajikistan as a contagion. He didn't want any part of this in his country, and he pretty much shut down the border entirely. Relations have deteriorated over the course of many years. New President Mirziyoyev, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, is different. He's embraced better relations regionally, and it could help Tajikistan in the future because, like I said, they're in the corner. To get anything out of Tajikistan or into Tajikistan, it has to cross Uzbekistan at some point. So bad relations with Uzbekistan meant very limited potential connections with the outside world. Tajikistan is not in the Eurasian Economic Union. However, that could happen as soon as next year, which also might provide a boost for them. Like I said, it hasn't panned out so much for Kyrgyzstan yet, but maybe it will for them, and maybe it will later for Tajikistan as well. Turkmenistan. This is the tough one. As bad, at least there was some optimism in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Turkmenistan As Ambassador Courtney mentioned, I keep referring to you all the time here, thank you for doing some of the legwork for this for me on this one. Turkmenistan does have the fourth largest gas reserves in the world. It's true. And things should not be as bad as they are now. But it's a case of incredible mismanagement, I would say, on their part. Now, Turkmenistan, fourth largest gas reserves in the world. What does that mean exactly? Well, according to the BP Energy Analysis annual survey, they have nearly 18 trillion cubic meters of gas. Now, to put that in some perspective, that is enough to fulfill the European Union's gas needs, at least at the current rate, for 30 years, all the countries. So it's a lot of gas. However, they have so far, 10 years ago, I'll back this up a little bit. 10 years ago, Turkmenistan was exporting some 40 billion cubic meters of gas to Russia, about 8 billion cubic meters to Iran, and the China pipeline. The pipelines, actually, there's 3 at the moment. The first one was nearing completion, and things look good. The gas price was up. Currently, Russia dropped off. Russia halted its imports of Turkmen gas at the start of 2016. Now, they'd already dropped from 40 billion cubic meters in the latter part of the last decade to 4 billion cubic meters by the time Russia canceled the contract with them. Iran, in 2017, Turkmenistan cited what they claimed was an unpaid debt from 2007, 2008, and said it was various figures, 1.8 billion, 2 billion, something like that. But the result was that Iran said, we're not going to pay, and Turkmenistan shut them off. So, 10 years ago, they exported 48 billion cubic meters of gas. The price was high and rising. As of today, they export a little more than 30 billion cubic meters to China. It is the only customer they have, and the price of gas is obviously about half of what it was just 4 years ago. As one would imagine, the economy of Turkmenistan is taking a big hit off this. Yes. Move on. Okay, now there is, of the 3 lines that I mentioned, 3 gas lines that go from Turkmenistan to China, right? That's, there's line A, line B carry 10 billion cubic meters of gas, and, 15 billion cubic meters of gas, and line C carries 25 billion cubic meters of gas to China. Now, of that 55 billion cubic meters of gas, China has included 10 billion that they'll take from Uzbekistan and 10 billion that they'll take from Kazakhstan. So of the functioning pipelines going to China right now, and again, China is the only customer Turkmenistan has, Turkmenistan will probably hit 32 billion cubic meters or something. They're already coming up on the limit. Kazakhstan's already signaled that it can make its 10 billion cubic meters really soon. Uzbekistan is probably 5 or 6, but they do have a contract saying they can take up as much as 10. So there's no very limited room anyway for expansion for Turkmenistan to sell any more gas to China until they build line D, which is already very delayed. Now, that will carry 30 billion cubic meters of gas, and it will all be Turkmen gas, but the fact is they're way behind schedule. We don't know when that will come online, and until then, there are no other means, customers for Turkmenistan's gas at the moment. They've talked about TAPI. We've heard this before, that Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. For security reasons, it's probably not going to happen, certainly won't happen anytime soon. Turkmenistan claims to have built their section of the pipeline already. There was a ceremony earlier this year in February to inaugurate the launch of the pipeline in Afghanistan, but the fact is there's fighting just over the border in Afghanistan. Part of that pipeline, even once it gets through the western part of Afghanistan, is going to have to hook east and go through places like Helmand province and stuff, so it's just kind of unfeasible, to me anyway. I don't see them being able to do this at the moment. The Trans-Caspian is a possibility too, but we don't know. Russia's signaled, and the Iranians have signaled, that they still have reservations about the construction of a Trans-Caspian pipeline, which would, if it would met expectations, ship an additional 30 billion cubic meters of gas from Turkmenistan across the Caspian, through the Caucasus, and on to Europe. But again, we don't know. This is not a near-term project. We won't realize this in the next 10 years from the looks either, which means Turkmenistan has no visible source of new income on the horizon whatsoever. In the meantime, The government has managed to spend $5 billion, estimated $5 billion, on hosting the Asian indoor and martial arts games. They spent $2.3 billion building a new airport outside Ashgabat, which hardly anyone uses to this day. And they spent another $1.5 billion improving the port facilities at Turkmenbashi city, which also are pretty much empty and really not much options, not much chances at the moment for seeing any serious traffic coming into there. So they're losing money, and then they're spending money on stuff which doesn't seem to improve the life of certainly the average person in the country. Now, how are they dealing with the fact that they have less revenue? Well, budget cuts, of course, across the board, layoffs, including not just state officials, but officials and employees in the gas industry and oil industry. This is the backbone of their economy. According to most estimates, gas sales mostly, but some oil sales account for anywhere between 70 and 80% of the money they take in during the year. And like I said, right now they're down to one customer and the prices are extremely low. And of the gas they sell to China, I must mention, China has extended huge loans to Turkmenistan to build the pipeline to bring gas to China and to develop the gas fields that supply the gas to the pipelines that go to China. So Turkmenistan doesn't get all the money for the gas that they send to China. China deducts an unknown percentage to pay off the loans that Turkmenistan accepted. We don't know how much, but it certainly cuts the amount of money that Turkmenistan is actually receiving at the moment. Now, on the ground, what does this look like? Well, for the last 2 years, we've been reporting at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, our Turkmen service, that there are shortages of flour, sugar, cooking oil. These goods are available at private stores, but for 2 or 3 times the state price. And as I mentioned, there's already been layoffs in a bunch of sectors. We don't know what the unemployment figure is in Turkmenistan, but best guess is at least 60% of the eligible workforce is out of work. They have not devalued the manat, their national currency, despite the fact that their economy is hurting. It remains at 3.5 to $1. The black market rate is 6 or 7 times that at the moment. They've prohibited exchanges for, at least for citizens, in hard currency. But at the same time, if you hear the stories about the old grandmas and grandpas that are stashing money in their mattresses or burying it, putting it in jars and burying it in the yard, they've had to draw on these reserves of their own hard currency simply to exchange that to get money, because even manat are in short supply in the country. They're reluctant to print more of them, and a lot of times people have a hard time getting actual cash. They've tried to move their economy over to a plastic card-based economy. Unfortunately, a lot of stores don't have the machinery to take the cards, so you still have to use cash to pay for a lot of this stuff. And there's simply a drying up of any kind of actual money that people can use, which means if they do devalue the manat, and people have been saving manat, they're going to take a big hit on this too when they finally decide what the devaluation would be. There was, ever since the early days of Turkmenistan, the government provided an allotment of water, electricity, and gas free to the public. Because of the economic situation, they just canceled that. And this is, I'm talking 25 years, more than 25 years this was available, but they just shut that down, and they're telling people they're going to have to pay for all this now. And again, like I said, many people are unemployed, many people don't have much money. They've imposed travel restrictions to keep people in the country, and this applies particularly to men 40 and younger, which means they're keeping people in the country who can't find a job, many of whom traveled to Turkey and places like that and did get money, find a job, get money, and send it back to help support relatives back home. Well, now you can't even do that. And in fact, if you are outside the country, they're trying to get you back into the country. The motivations for this, we can speculate about why that's true. A lot of things, radicalization, spreading bad words. I mean, so the situation's pretty bad. And I'll just wrap this up by saying, okay, what are the consequences for the future? Well, for Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, being dependent on China and Russia means that you're never going to, it affects your sovereignty of the country. And by that, I don't mean that they're going to fall into become absorbed by Russia or China or anything like that. But the fact is that Russia and China will always have a great leverage over decisions being made in those two countries because they just owe them too much money for them to say no to anything at the moment. Turkmenistan is a stranger case. I would have to call this a failing state. They can't provide for the people, which is already bad enough. But they spend money on just ridiculous things that I can't possibly understand. They pride, at least the government and the President Gurbanguly Berdimuhammedov prides himself in saying that the Guinness Book of Records has registered Ashgabat as having the highest, density of marble buildings in the world. Well, so what? And they keep coming up with these kind of things, and this is what's on state media all the time. If you listen to Turkmen state media, it's a fantastic place. They got everything. It's the golden era of happiness at the moment, as a matter of fact. But I have to wonder how long this could go on. Like I said, in another country, the government could easily have been facing serious resistance. The only thing that keeps Turkmenistan from falling, in my opinion, is the fact that it only has a few cities, big cities in the country, and there's great distances between them. You cannot foment a popular revolution in a country like that. Maybe, unless it happened in the capital, there's no way to do it because it's too easy to isolate all these cities. If something breaks out in one place, and it might have, they can cordon off the area and fix everything, arrest the rabble-rousers, and no one would even know about it, and it couldn't spread to another part of the country. So that might be one of the only things that's keeping the government in power. Russia signaled that it's ready to it's considering resuming imports of Turkmen gas, but as I said, it was 4 billion cubic meters when the last time they were importing gas. That will not balance the budget in Turkmenistan. That's not even $1 billion worth of income. It's far cry from what they need in that country. There might be some lifelines held out just for the simple reason that it's in China and Russia's interest not to see instability break out in a place like Turkmenistan. It's the same argument you could make for Tajikistan, actually, too. So they might be willing to extend some help or some financial assistance openly behind closed doors. I don't know, simply to keep the government there. It does border Afghanistan, and that part of the Afghan border is a place where the Islamic State has been known to have had havens. So for that reason, maybe someone will prop them up, but otherwise the government, every time I look at the news, it's just worse and worse. Like I said, the inability to feed the people properly. They can't find the food they need. There's no employment in the place. And on top of it, as if that wasn't enough, they just had these salt storms. You would have heard about the Aral Sea, the desiccation of the Aral Sea, and the fact that the water's almost gone. It has turned the soil, alkaline soil is now at the surface. There were windstorms twice this year that blew all that salt onto the fields, the agricultural fields in the north and in the eastern part of the country, and those crops are ruined. So we're on the edge of winter. People are now having to pay for gas, electricity, and water. They can't find food, at least sufficient amounts of food like they were accustomed to being able to get all these years. So I don't know. Like I said, the only thing that's keeping them propped up now is there's just too much space between cities for anything to any kind of resistance, legitimate resistance to foment in the country. We'll have to see. Like I said, it's essentially a failed state.
Okay, you did indeed provide us with some bad news. Before I turn it over to questions to the audience, I have a couple of things I wanted to sort of put out there. The one country that we didn't really spend much time drilling down on is Uzbekistan, which in a lot of ways may be more in the good news camp since the transition to the new president, the opening up of the borders, and the improvement of relations with neighboring countries. So I was wondering if Bill or Bruce or both of you could say something about how the political and economic transformation in Uzbekistan has played out, what the effects are domestically, and what it means for the other economies in the region. And then, Bruce, I had a particular question for you. You mentioned the Chinese and Russian the dependence on Chinese and Russian investment in some of the smaller countries in the region. And we talk a lot about the implications of that for these countries' sovereignty, especially when it comes to Russia. And that can be, you should join the Eurasian Economic Union, or you should maybe not have an American military base on your territory. But have you seen examples of China using this economic dependence as a way of putting political pressure, compromising sovereignty, whatever you want to call it, on states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan? So maybe let's start with the Uzbekistan question and then turn over to that.
Okay, sure. Just a quick comment on Uzbekistan. So this is really a top-down reform effort. If one looks at the period of time, a couple of years, Uzbekistan has made quite substantial reforms in such a short period of time. The question is, to what extent will they gain momentum? For example, often reforms can gain more, economic reforms can gain more momentum if more small and medium-sized enterprises, particularly small enterprises, find economic benefit and become proponents of reforms. Well, we don't really see that yet in Uzbekistan, but if something like that were to happen, one can be a bit more optimistic. There have been some cases where reforms come after a popular revolution. The Rose Revolution in Georgia is the best example in many respects, where you have popular support that was kind of pent up because under Shevardnadze there was a kind of a long era of stagnation, if you will. Shevardnadze made reforms at the beginning and then slowed down, and then there was a long era of stagnation. Reforms fell behind. There was pent up pressure for reforms, but they were popularly driven, if you will. You have a sense in Uzbekistan, too, a long sense of era of stagnation, although the economy is growing faster, but it was basically utilizing more capacity in many respects. Are we seeing popular support for reforms emerge? So far, at least from the outside, it's hard to tell to what extent popular support is helping to drive those reforms, which might make them a bit more ephemeral in the future. It's hard to know. It's hard to predict that sort of thing. One aspect I would mention is competition with Kazakhstan. When the Soviet Union broke up, very quickly there was kind of competition between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and this is embodied in some sense in the two leaders of those two countries. And I was out in Kazakhstan right at the beginning after independence. What we really didn't see for then, at that point, was that Kazakhstan's strategy would be to open up to the world as a way of improving its economy and enhancing its sovereignty and independence. And that Uzbekistan's strategy would be the opposite, would be to close itself off from the world. And so that, from an economic standpoint, led to more economic autarky, more top-down decision-making, things like forced labor and the cotton harvest and stuff like that. So it's reasonable to expect that there's a lot of pent-up, let's say, pressure in society. And so what Mirziyoyev is doing, he's not doing this because he's a Gaidar or a Saakashvili. He's doing this because there was a long era of stagnation in Uzbekistan. People are frustrated with low per capita income, for example. Kazakhstan's per capita income is several times higher than, I think maybe four times higher than Uzbekistan's. That's an unstable situation in some respects. So you have a sense, on the one hand, that Mirziyoyev is responding to pent-up pressure and this long era of stagnation, but on the other hand, a good competitive desire to catch up with Kazakhstan. This Karimov was resentful of Kazakhstan's success in many respects, and that probably extends further down in the elite structure of Uzbekistan. So that may help drive reforms, this competition aspect, as well as popular pressure for reforms. But until we see more popular manifestations of this support for reform, it'd be harder to predict. With Rose Revolution, we saw those manifestations quickly, but with this, we don't yet see it.
China, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. Okay. Well, the first thing I want to mention is that China's strong entry into Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan coincided more or less with the Russian economic problems at the end of the last decade too. So for the Central Asians across the board, really, but certainly for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, it was extremely welcome that China was able to come in, help them with some of the infrastructure projects that they had, provide employment for some of the people out there, be able to give them loans, things like that. The problem I've always had with China's role in that, and I mentioned One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, whichever you wish to call it, is that these projects are ultimately all the projects that China is engaged in out there have benefited China. Now, before there was OBOR and Belt and Road Initiative, there was what they were doing in Central Asia, and I've always suspected that the model for OBOR, it was actually what they'd already done in Central Asia. They'd seen that this network of railway lines, roads, pipelines, and everything worked, and brought all this stuff back to China, which was ultimately what they were looking for from Central Asia. They tend to view Central Asia more as a resource base, so they don't have to touch their own stuff at the moment. Again, it's a Chinese presence in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan is very welcome because they do, who else is going to build these roads that connect the north and the south or the east and the west? Russia for years had that opportunity, but their economy has been up and down too, and they never accomplished it. I used to take Kyrgyzstan's roads all over the place, certainly the north to south road. Some of them were in horrible shape. I mean, there was places, the main road between Bishkek and Osh was mostly unpaved. There was no asphalt on it. And I was just there a few years ago, and you can do some of these drives in several hours that used to take the better part of a day. And in the meantime, they employ, it's about half and half. The Chinese have their own people that work on it, but they do employ people at those sites, so this is all welcome for them. And it's down to practically a micro level, too. It's amazing. Alex Cooley, for instance, talked about the hardware of this, and by that he meant the railways, the roads, and things like that. But if you take a closer look, you'll find out that China owns the oil refineries and owns the gas stations and owns the restaurants that are alongside the road and everything to bring that out there. So these countries have taken huge loans, which they can't possibly hope to pay off. My suspicion was always that they were hoping they would get the same kind of deal that they got with Russia for years and years now, and this has happened several times with both of them, where they run up a big debt, and all of a sudden Russia sees that they have a use for one of them and decides to write off a huge part or all of that debt. I was wondering if the Chinese would be willing to do it, and I was kind of skeptical that they might be able to go that far, but we've seen that they actually did do just that, and with some of the African states and with Venezuela too. So that's possible. Now that said, there's another aspect to this relationship too, which is important, is that if you look at all the countries that border China and think about who are their neighbors, the Western neighbors in Central Asia are friendly, which means a lot to a country like China. I mean, Vietnam, no. India, no. Even Russia, historically, no. So if what is peanuts to the Chinese of a couple $2 billion buys a friendly neighbor, that it might be worth it for them to buy, to just write off debt and certainly keep some level of investment out there. But again, it does give them leverage that other people don't have, which I haven't really seen too many examples of to date, but one can imagine that they could use this in the future. And of course, it's in their interest to preserve the status quo. So if you have some reformist government or something that may threaten Chinese relations, then maybe we'll see a different attitude toward some of these states in Central Asia, and more aggressive Chinese policy toward some of these countries. Like I said, the way it is now is the way that China wants to keep it, which means that we're not probably going to see a lot of progress and development in these countries politically anyway in the coming years.
Okay, great, thanks. We've got about 15, 20 minutes for questions. So please, raise your hand, wait for a microphone, identify yourself, be brief, and ask a question. So over here in the back.
Hi, good afternoon. Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in Washington. I have a question about Kazakhstan. A few months ago, Kazakhstan launched the Astana International Financial Center, which is supposed to be this hub like Dubai, like Singapore, like London, to bring international investment to Kazakhstan and then to the rest of Central Asia. Just today, President Nazarbayev launched the first trading session of the stock exchange of the International Center. What's your opinion about of this international center? Do you think that it's going to be able to succeed in attracting investment from Western markets, which is what Kazakhstan wants, to Central Asia? Thank you. and with that promote development? Thank you.
That's a good question. Almaty has a functioning stock market, a functioning financial center, which actually plays a significant role. The location of Almaty, close to the rest of Central Asia, as well as being the commercial hub of Kazakhstan, suggests that markets might validate a financial center in Almaty. It remains to be seen whether the markets will validate a financial center in Astana, which is distant from the rest of Central Asia. And it's not clear, Astana is closer to Russia and China, but it's not so clear yet how much they will need this. It's important for any financial center to be one that's voluntarily used. It's important that government not compel private enterprise, for example, to use a financial center. Hopefully that will be the case. Some Kazakhstanians have said that that will be the case in the future. The issue of having a totally separate legal system within the context of Astana Financial Center. In legal circles in Kazakhstan, there is a debate. A lot of prominent advocates in Kazakhstan argue that it would be better to improve the legal system of Kazakhstan and would result in more durable, enduring improvements of conditions for private business activity than to have a separate, isolated structure. For example, if one has a legal system in the Astana International Financial Center and it renders a judgment that has to be enforced someplace else in Kazakhstan, how will that take place if that other part of Kazakhstan uses the general Kazakhstani legal code? So there are a lot of questions, but the market has validated the Almaty Center. Now, one more issue. There's an IPO coming up for Kazatomprom, the Kazakhstan Atomic Energy Company. I believe the intention is to sell about 15% of the shares for that. Probably many in London, but some through the AIFC. So this will be a test of what kind of demand there is for people to use the AIFC for purchases of shares. For example, if risk assessments in London are somewhat consistent with risk assessments among Kazakhstani buyers, for example, then London is more attractive because it has a better track record. If, on the other hand, risk assessments in the outside world are much, let's say, risk is perceived as to be higher than in Kazakhstan, then the AIFC may do relatively better in the market. So this will be a test.
Ola Olaker, CSIS, thanks for doing this. Predicting is hard, especially the future, so I'm not going to ask you to predict, but I am going to ask you to maybe spin out some plausible scenarios for what happens in Turkmenistan, given the very difficult situation that the country's in. Thanks.
Yeah, speculation. It always comes back to haunt you in the end. I would, what I said about the security situation in Afghanistan, I think will be the priority for a lot of countries. If it looks like the Turkmen government is about to fall, I would imagine that they will get help, probably behind the scenes from, China's made a huge investment in Turkmenistan. They don't want to see that government fall. Russia doesn't want the instability and really has forced certainly the visit of the Russian defense minister on the Turkmen by citing, saying it's not just the Turkmen-Afghan border, it's the southern CIS Turkmen border. Now, having said that Russia wouldn't want to see instability, that does not preclude the possibility that if they had their own guy they thought could do it better, that maybe there would be a change at the top of the president in Turkmenistan. It's really not in anyone's interest to see it become a failed state and start to fall apart. Even the Iranians wouldn't want that. Uzbekistan wouldn't want that. So I think they'll probably be held together as long as they can keep the people in line. And of course, the people are cowed, for more than, well, now it's 27 years of this security service and everyone trying to root this stuff out. We have heard complaints out loud, which is something significant. These people are used to not airing grievances in public, but they do now. So it's a sign of how serious the situation is. It's the way the president especially seems to be oblivious to this when he shows up that really concerns me. That said, we've seen that there is a formula in Turkmenistan for replacing the leader and bringing someone you've never heard of and putting them in power and building them up from the dentist we have now to the great infallible leader that he's become. That's another possibility too. But like I said, at the end of the day, it's really in no one's interest to see this country fall apart. And I think that the current government might be banking on that if things really start to fall apart, that someone will step in and help them financially or with security problems or something and keep them there.
Just a quick comment on gas. So with the conclusion of the Caspian Sea delimitation accord, making it more possible for there to be a gas pipeline under the Caspian Sea to Azerbaijan to join up with the Southern Gas Corridor, Russia made a certain amount of concessions in that agreement, but what it does is open up a little bit of leverage for Turkmenistan. So it's not accidental, as they say in Russian, that Alexei Miller, the Gazprom CEO, shows up in Ashgabat shortly after that to offer to buy, as Bruce said, 4 BCM of gas, because Russia will have a commercial interest, or Gazprom will have a commercial interest in the Trans-Caspian pipeline not being built. And so a good way to try to take some of the air out of that balloon would be to start buying gas again. And then also there's the issue of Nord Stream 2. Russia may need some additional gas to fill up Nord Stream 2. So at the margin, Turkmenistan's leverage has been improved a little bit.
Can I ask Bruce a related question, which is, how much do we know about what's going on in Turkmenistan? How do we get information about political developments in the country, and how much do we actually know?
Well, fortunately, a lot of people actually have VPN and things like that they can get in touch with us. Admittedly, we're only getting a very bits and pieces of what's happening in the country. Story from one town in the north, story from 1 or 2 towns in the east. It is possible to get it out, and I know that certainly Turkmen officials would say you don't know the whole picture, but nobody does know the whole picture out there. But there's where there's smoke, there's fire. There's enough of this stuff coming across that you have to give some of it credence that this really is it. And it's not just us. To be fair, Izvestia just put an article out 2 weeks ago about how bad things are in Turkmenistan. So, all right, maybe Russia's playing a political game and using Izvestia for this, but of all the countries to do this, Uzbek state television had 3 different channels broadcast the problems they had in Turkmenistan and showed that they had deficits, people had a hard time finding employment. This is supposedly a friendly neighbor, and they were actually willing to air this and say that the economic situation in Turkmenistan is failing. Now, whether Uzbekistan might have its own motives. Ambassador Courtney already mentioned Uzbekistan is also developing its economy, so this solves 2 problems at once. You talk about the economic problems in Turkmenistan, but by comparison, now Uzbekistan looks pretty good. We're getting there, but we're certainly not where our neighbor is. So hold with us for a while.
Okay, here on the aisle.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Victoria Clement from the Marine Corps University. I'm wondering about, Bruce, if you could just comment on a little bit more about travel out of Turkmenistan. You mentioned that men under 40 are restricted, because it would seem that an obvious solution to the unemployment problem would be to work outside of the country. I know that there are a lot of women who are employed or self-employed in the shuttle trade to Turkey. Are women restricted in the same way as men? Okay.
They are not, to some extent. They check to see what they're taking out of the country with them, but they're not subject to, generally, they're not subject to the same kind of restrictions for leaving the country. And like I said, there really is no, I agree with you. This seems to be the perfect solution. The same thing that Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan have been doing for years. We don't have enough employment. Go. Find work, send the money back. Great for everybody that it works out that way, except for the migrant laborers who are exploited, beaten, and things like that. But it's hard to figure out what the explanation is for why the Turkmen wouldn't want to let people out. There's something they think these people are susceptible to that happens outside the country that makes them a potential threat, and we don't really know. Is that because they've had some people join some of these groups in the Middle East and they're worried they might come back, and so the solution is to keep them in the country? Are they going out and talking to the media and saying, I left because things are horrible and it ruins the whole narrative the government's been spinning? Is it none of those and something else? I don't know. But it doesn't seem to make any sense. I agree.
Ashasani, Middle East Program here at CSIS. So I've been reading reports on the Chabahar Agreement that all make mentions of how a multimodal system could open up Central Asia to trade from the Indian Ocean through Iran. And Iran and India have invested a lot of money into bits and pieces of this. But as someone who's spent time there, I don't really see how the countries would pull this off. And do you see any hope in that the countries could work together, that Afghanistan's stable enough to kind of be the center of all this, or is that just optimism?
In Pakistan, generally anything that's going to go south across the Central Asian border is going to work, is it not? If it has to go through Afghanistan, how much are you going to bank on that? And like I said, as far as OBOR is concerned in Central Asia, it was there before Xi Jinping stood up in Kazakhstan and said in 2013 that this is our great strategy. Everything was built in Central Asia already then. How well they can cooperate between each other is a question too. Now, you mentioned Chabahar specifically, but I'll give you another example. I mentioned the Turkmenbashi city port that they just opened after $1.5 billion, refurbishment, modernization, things like that. The problem with that is stuff coming from China headed west passes two new Kazakh ports, in Aktau and then one in Kurik, which is very close to the railway line. Now, are you going to ship it all the way down to Turkmenistan to get it across the Caspian? Admittedly, there is a railway link that will take it all the way down into Iran, but as I mentioned, Turkmenistan and Iran aren't getting along very well at the moment either. So these are the kind of things that you can't predict when you build something like that, an infrastructure like that, a trade network. But it definitely works against them. In an ideal world, yes. Peace in Afghanistan, good relations between the regional countries, all this would work fine. Unfortunately, the reality is what it is, and I don't see right now that it's going to work.
Thank you very much. I'm Ruslan Manalbayev with the Eurasia Foundation. My question is, what would be your recommendation for how the U.S. government develops its policy in Central Asia? Is it business as usual? Is it trying something else? Given the the big influences that the governments of China and Russia and other regional players have in that part of the world, what would be your recommendation for how the U.S. proceeds?
Yeah, we are in Washington after all.
Yes, that's a key question right now, given the overall foreign policy orientation of the Trump administration. Over the years, the United States and the West in general have sought to be, if you will, honest brokers and investors in Central Asia, but have not sought to maintain a permanent military presence or have Central Asia be a sphere of influence. European Union, for example, excluded countries to the east of the Caspian Sea from the European Union Partnership Program. So that pretty much continues. From the standpoint of the United States, we have very substantial U.S. investors in Kazakhstan, and U.S. diplomacy always tries to help support U.S. investors. And secondly, Kazakhstan and the other Central Asians are wedged between two giants. So those countries generally want the West to be more involved in order to help them balance between those two. In some respects, I often tell people, go back and look at 18th century balance of power politics in Europe, and it's a good way to try to understand how to conduct diplomacy in the current situation. Because you have, with China overwhelming economic power growing in Central Asia, and Russia still has security power, but traditionally in most countries' diplomacy, economic power tends to be followed by some security interests. So in some respects, the correlation of forces, the twist in the correlation of forces may be greater in Central Asia than some other parts of the world. So a key role the West can play is to help the countries manage those kinds of things and encourage investment to help those countries develop further and encourage economic and political reforms.
I mean, really, the thing I would stress on that is the balancing act. They don't want to be under the thumb of both Russia and China. I mean, they need options in the future. If both sides are pressuring them, they got to have somebody to turn to. What they're going to have to do is engender some trust in Western companies and Western governments that your commitment to these countries or your investment is going to be worthwhile and not change overnight, which we've seen a couple times, or be just vanish in the case of investment, as we've seen sometimes. If you're going to open up a plant or a factory, you expect to get a profit. And if all of a sudden you find out that you're running a loss and then the government seizes your assets in the country or something, which has happened before, then there's no point in being there. So.
Hi, I'm Bill Veal, President Emeritus of the U.S.-Kazakhstan Business Association, which I ran for 15 years. And I wanted to just say something in general, that the description of the mega projects in the energy field that the panel has presented here, I think are one of the foundational aspects of the political economies of the area there, that there is a top-down, trickle-down, controllable political economy in the region. And what we're seeing now, I think, with the rise of a new Uzbekistan is a greater intra-regional awareness of the potentials. They're getting a steady drumbeat from the international financial institutions that you're a region with the lowest intra-regional trade of any other region in the world. And there are more and more elites with, business elites with communication across borders in the area now. So there's a great potential for SMEs to grow and start exploiting things. Bill, you mentioned the SME dimension of this, and it seems to me that this is the bottom-up approach which Western policy needs to encourage and international financial institutions need to encourage. And I would ask if members of the panel could comment on that and what you see with the prospects for that in the region. Thank you.
So with regard to small, medium-sized enterprise, SMEs, in some sense, if one wants to look at a single statistic that might give you some confidence that reform will go forward in a country, political and economic reform will go forward, economic openness policies will go forward, it's the percentage of SMEs in GDP. In most of the former Soviet states, small, medium-sized enterprises are remarkably small percentages of GDP. Russia's being an outstanding example of that. So from the standpoint of improving prospects for economic growth in all those areas, growing SME, the fraction of SME in the GDP is critically important. And what's interesting about SMEs generally don't have a lot of political power in the national capital. They tend to be more distributed. So they won't prosper unless governance is decentralized, unless economic opportunity is decentralized, unless large, inefficient, often corrupt state-owned enterprises are privatized. And what we see in a lot of the former Soviet space is very little privatization of those large state-owned enterprises, and yet at the same time, leaders of the country say, well, we want more investment, we want to grow faster, but with all those state-owned enterprises choking off big parts of the economy, it's hard to grow the SMEs. So SMEs and reform kind of go together. We hope, certainly in Uzbekistan, which probably has a greater opportunity for more SME growth than Kazakhstan because of the energy predominance in Kazakhstan and the metals and mining predominance in Kazakhstan. Hopefully, Uzbekistan will pursue that and make a big contribution. Now, this will be really important for manufacturing, because manufacturing often, again, doesn't involve the highest level of political clout. There are some exceptions like the GM auto plant in Uzbekistan, for example. But Kazakhstan doesn't have enough people for manufacturing to be not enough large enough consumer market. But if Uzbekistan were to open up and there to be free trade across those borders, and that, of course, would probably require Uzbekistan to have some arrangement, either being in the Eurasian Economic Union, as long as Kazakhstan is, or some other kind of arrangement. But the size of the market for manufacturing would make it a lot more attractive in the region.
I mean, that was one of the rationales that Russia provided for countries like Kazakhstan to join the Eurasian Economic Union, was that it would give them access to a much bigger market for whatever kind of goods they were going to be producing. Has that actually had an impact?
Well, let's look at the General Electric locomotive plant in Astana. It's produced something, these are world-class locomotives. It's produced over 100 locomotives. I'm not sure how many more than 100. But virtually all of them have been sold in Central Asia, maybe a couple outside. The big market would be the Russian railway system. But thus far, the Eurasian Economic Union has not been working to such an extent that that factory is able to sell locomotives in the Russian market. And that would suggest that the system, the Eurasian Economic Union, is not working so well yet.
Mohammed Tahir from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Just a quick question. Last week we had a major attack in Tajikistan, attack or rebellion, let's say, in jail, which was connected to, at least allegedly, to ISIS. And this is the second ISIS-linked attack within few weeks in Tajikistan. So is it an isolated incident, or it is part of some sort of trend that's going on in Tajikistan? Can this also have some links to the economic problems that the country is facing? How do you see the trend in this?
The attack on the bicyclist, yes, I mean, absolutely. The video appeared not long after that. It was pretty clear that these guys had somehow or another not only been come under the influence of ISIS, but had been in contact with them, that they could send this video back so it could be played right after the attack. What happened in the prison, I don't know. It's entirely possible. There was a riot in this prison after the peace deal was in 1997. Thank you, Katie, for giving me the exact year last night. But I knew there was one 20 years ago. It's well known that these people are abused. Prisoners are abused all the time in jail cells. There could be a lot of reasons they did this. ISIS is an opportunistic organization. Certainly, they can probably legitimately claim to have had a hand in this attack on the tourists. And once they saw that there was an attack on this prison, they might have figured, we already have kind of a toehold in Tajikistan already. Let's go forward and say that this is also us, and maybe we'll advance our own interests or get some more recruits doing that. You know, like I said, I tend to be skeptical that they had anything to do with the prison. I haven't seen any evidence that would convince me that they absolutely were involved. I think they just found out it happened and decided it is a place where they keep prisoners who were convicted for religious extremism. But that does not mean that ISIS was able to get their message all the way into prison and say what you need to do is stage a riot, you know, and then we'll get more support and more recruits from Tajikistan.
And the Tajik government has used accusations of ISIS membership or ISIS participation in various kinds of unrest in the past as an excuse for its fairly draconian response or as a way of attracting outside support for what it's trying to do. So when you get these kind of communications from the Tajik government and there's not great corroborating information from other sources, I think, I agree. I think it's worth sometimes taking with a grain of salt. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, Tim Freeman, Palladium. I was wondering if you could speak towards the steps that Uzbekistan has taken towards more economic growth in diverse sectors and whether that could be applied to the rest of the region.
I'm not familiar with the details of their reform efforts, but if one looks at what we've seen so far, they look to be reforms. Now, recently on Mohammed's Majlis podcast, which I hope you're all listening to, he had a discussion about is what is happening in Uzbekistan modernization or is it reform? Well, thus far it's clearly reform. The question is, if it doesn't have popular support, then it may devolve into modernization rather than just reform. So thus far, I think, for example, in the trying to just open up the economy regionally, trying to improve some monetary and fiscal policies, things like that. And we've seen some significant reforms.
On that real quick, yeah, I agree. There's not a model for Uzbekistan's economic reform. We don't know what exactly it looks like. It's an evolving process, and I don't think that anyone could say that these are the specific details of the reform. The fact that it's open is significant in itself. Again, like I said, Uzbekistan is in the center of Central Asia now. An uncooperative Uzbekistan means everyone loses out on this kind of deal. And I could give you the example. We'll go back to the Ragun Dam. Now they needed construction materials to build the dam, obviously cement, steel, things like this. Uzbekistan blocked many of these railway cars from coming in to do it, which meant that Tajikistan couldn't build the dam, which would make it self-sufficient and be able to allow it to export electricity. The fact that Uzbekistan will let trains through now, bringing construction materials, is in itself a change for the better and helps. That's one example, but I mean regionally, these are the kind of things that are going on, that a cooperative Uzbekistan is a benefit to everyone in the area.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, thank you all again for joining us this afternoon. Let's please thank our panelists.